Hello, I'm Dr. Forsberg, and this is the lecture on the correlates of terrorism. The purpose of this module is to understand those factors, those variables, that we know influence the beginnings of terrorism or the continuation of terrorism. This is not about counterterrorism. It is about stopping terrorism before it starts. It is about removing the impetus for terrorism so that once it does stop, it will not return. The word itself can be pronounced either as correlate or as in correlate. The former is a noun, the latter a verb. The verb means to compare things and bring them into a relation having corresponding characteristics. That is, when two things are correlated, they have a relationship between them. As one variable increases, does the other predictably change? If so, then there is a strong correlation between the two variables. If not, then there's not. For instance, the two variables, years of schooling and annual income, are highly correlated. Those who have more years of schooling tend to also make more money annually. Now, this does not mean that one is guaranteed to make more money for staying in school longer. It only means that there is a tendency for people with more schooling to make more money. Another example is the correlation between the rate of ice cream consumption and the crime rate. In a city, when there's a higher level of ice cream consumption, the crime rate is also higher. When the ice cream consumption declines, the crime rate does too. These two variables also have a positive correlation. Note that correlation is not the same thing as causation. High levels of correlation are necessary for causation, but they are not sufficient. For causation to be shown, high correlation, temporal precedence, and theoretic plausibility must all be demonstrated. In the first example, one can easily see that higher levels of education will cause higher income levels, on average. In the second example, it's obvious that there's a common cause to both ice cream consumption and crime rate: the temperature outside. A correlate is any factor, otherwise known as a variable, that correlates with the variable of interest. In the first example, years of schooling is a correlate of annual income. In the second example, the consumption rate of ice cream is a correlate of crime rate. For us, our variable of interest is the propensity for terrorism, and our correlates are the factors that are related to terrorism propensity. Such factors include, but are not limited to, the level of democracy in the state, the unemployment rate, and increased ethnic differentials. Determining the correlates of terrorism is all about answering the question, what factors are most associated with increased terrorist activity? Of course, we find this question important because knowing these factors allows us to influence the level of terrorism in a state or in the world. Of course, there may be factors that we either do not wish to change or that we cannot change. Thus, it is even more important to understand those factors, those correlates, that we are able to change. Notice again that we are not talking about causation. We are not saying that these variables cause a terrorist to act as they do. We are merely finding those factors that increase or decrease the pressure on a person to perform a terrorist act. On the following pages, where the correlates are listed, an arrow will also be present. If the arrow points upward, then that factor has a positive correlation with terrorism. If the arrow points downward, a negative correlation. Finally, lest you think these correlates are ice cream-caused crime sprees, as it were, these are more likely to cause the increased propensity to terrorism than vice versa. In each case, A large quantitative study was conducted that took into consideration the time lag between the change in the correlate and the increase in terrorism probability, thus demonstrating the temporal precedence required for causality. In order to get a better understanding of the world, social scientists organize the entire world of variables into 4 categories, called the 4 levels of analysis. And these are the system level, the state level, the group level, and the individual level. This categorization was designed to emphasize how the variables interact with entities in each of the 4 levels. For instance, level of democracy is a state-level variable. It is a certain aspect of the state. The level of democracy in a state affects the groups in the state and the individuals in the state quite easily. The level of democracy in a state, however, does not affect the system level. Another example would be, quote, national cohesion. This is a group level because the cohesion of the nation is an aspect of the nation itself, the group. It strongly affects the individuals within the nation. It does not per se affect either the state or the system. The number of cohesive nations in the state, however, is a state-level variable. The separation between the nations and the dominant group is a state-level variable. National cohesion by itself is not. Now, recall, a nation is an identifiable group of people. Ethnicities and societies are examples of nations. A country is a plot of land. A government is an organized bureaucracy designed to govern a people. And a state, and that's a capital S state, is an organized political community living under a government. It consists of a nation and a country. The system level of analysis consists of those variables describing the state of the world. These variables include proportions of states that are democracies, strength of international organizations, and level of globalization. Only this last is known to be a correlate of terrorism. Globalization, at its heart, is a measure of the interconnectedness of the world. Trade and intercultural interactions both drive globalization. Unfortunately, the latter is very difficult to measure. The former, much easier. As a result, most long-term measures of globalization use the level of world trade. The level of globalization in a system is a positive correlate of terrorism because these increased interactions threaten the status quo, the present power structures within a state. Those in power want to stay in power. They also have the power to fight. If they see globalization as a threat to their power, they will fight it. The globalization does not affect all powers equally. The rich gain from globalization. Thus, the wealthy states are happy with the increase of globalization. The traditional states, which tend to be poor and also tend to be led by traditional leaders, are threatened by the changes wrought by globalization. They are the ones who fight it. They are also the ones who are best able to teach their subjects about the dangers of globalization, turning them against it. We beam Lady Gaga into villages in Yemen. Her bouncing around threatens the power structures within Yemen since the tribal elders are not able to keep their followers from being exposed to this change. Therefore, they feel threatened, and therefore they work to end the threat that is Lady Gaga. A second thing globalization does is increase short-term wealth disparities between the state groups, the wealthy North and the poor South in general. Showing people what they cannot have causes invidiousness, which leads to a pressure to act to right the differences. At the state level, we have 7 correlates. Not all of these have the same strength in predicting the prevalence of terrorism, however. In the previous slide, we examined globalization as a correlate. In reality, globalization is currently a minor factor in terrorism calculations, but it is a very important factor in global wealth. If we completely ignore globalization as terrorism researchers, predictions are only slightly impacted. At the state level, there are two variables that are extremely important in predicting terrorism: use of terrorism in the state in the previous year, and style of government. The previous use of terrorism in a state is the best predictor of the current use of terrorism in the state at this level. This underscores the importance of stopping terrorism before it happens. This is previous use in the state, not just previous use by the group, which is going to be covered later. For instance, Spain has both a Basque terrorist group and a Catalonian terrorist group. It turned out that Tierra Liuri became active shortly after ETA became active. A similar thing happened in France with the National Liberation Front of Corsica and MGAN of Brittany. The second most important factor at the state level is the government type. Basically, there are three types of government: autocracy, anocracy, and democracy. In an autocracy, why do I always study things I can't pronounce? A single person or a small junta holds all the power in the state. The decisions by this person or small group have no legal constraints. There is no popular control. A democracy is the opposite end of the spectrum from an autocracy. In a democracy, the decisions of the government are checked by the people in a very real way. The third type, anocracy, contains elements of both autocracy and democracy. However, anocracies are characterized more by the lack of power that is held by the central government than anything else. Examples of autocracies include Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and North Korea. Examples of democracies include the United States of America, Mexico, and Sweden. Examples of anocracies include Mali, Somalia, and Zimbabwe. Strong autocracies are marked by their total lack of terrorism. Anocracies usually suffer from widespread rebellion, not terrorism. Democracies suffer from terrorism. In all democracies, there are expectations by the people on the government of certain rights. Amongst these are speech, assembly, freedom of travel. These three rights make it easy for like-minded individuals to congregate and to form cells. When the cells get large enough, they begin to use terrorism to achieve their goals. It is interesting that the presence of voting only exacerbates this move to terrorism. Most terrorist groups do not see the political system as legitimate. Additionally, if a political party does exist corresponding to the terrorist group, many governments increase the probability that a group will use terrorism by outlawing that political party. For instance, Batasuna for the ETA and Sinn Féin for the Irish Republican Army. In the United States, the vast majority of terrorist attacks are by homegrown terrorists, terrorists who are born and raised here. Some examples include the Posse Comitatus, the Earth Liberation Front, and the Aryan Nations. Do these groups hate our freedom? They love our freedom, and they're fighting for it in their own way. Even worse than being a democracy is being a democratizing autocracy. It is almost a guarantee that a harsh dictatorship who moves towards democracy will suffer from terrorism. For instance, Myanmar, Iran, and Iraq. Why is democratization dangerous? Well, among other reasons, in an established democracy, the relationship between the people and the government is well understood. There is a large level of stability in such states. When democratization happens, that relationship is unknown. People cast about to determine the appropriate relationship, and this instability, otherwise known as a power vacuum, gives terrorist groups room to act. Government strength. The government type ties into the effect of government strength. The weakest governments tend not to suffer from terrorism. They suffer from larger forms of conflict. The strongest governments do not suffer from terrorism. They're much better able at controlling their people so that such groups cannot form. It is those states in the middle that suffer the most from terrorism. Why is this so? I'll let you think about that. A stronger economy, as measured in change in gross domestic product per capita, will tend to have a lower incidence of terrorism. Recalling the conclusions of Martha Crenshaw, this really does offer a typical tie to grievances. As many ethnicities have a, quote, typical job, if all sectors of the economy are doing well except for that sector, grievances will multiply. If all sectors are doing well, those grievances do not increase. There's also a view in such a situation that the government is doing well and is successful, and therefore has legitimacy. On the other hand, if the economy is in a recession, or is actually growing at less than 2% per year, there's a strong perception that the government is a failure and should be removed by whatever means necessary. That is the source of the impetus for terrorism. It is interesting that the ethnic group does not need to be economically disadvantaged for the state for the pressure to exist. The Basques in Spain were actually economically advanced compared to the rest of Spain. They just saw themselves as being held back by the Castilians, and hence the grievance. The unemployment rate ties into many previous issues we've been discussing here, including the strength of the economy, the strength of the government, and the existence of grievances. Higher unemployment translates into a greater number of grievances. They see the higher unemployment and the failure of the government, and therefore, because they have more grievances, ever greater pressure to become a terrorist increases. Furthermore, the unemployed have a lot of time on their hands, which means they're better able to spend that time being terrorists. Additionally, a greater level of urbanization in the country tends to correspond to a higher probability of terrorism. Why? Well, urbanization offers two things needed by terrorists: targets and recruits. Urban areas have a plethora of high-profile targets. Urban areas also have a greater level of disparity amongst the various ethnic and religious groups, greater levels of unemployment, greater levels of poverty, and greater levels of dissatisfaction. All of these combine to create a greater pool of potential terrorists. While this is a low-quality predictor of terrorist events, it is a very troubling predictor because the historical trend is towards urbanization, movement from the countryside to the city. In fact, all states that have an annual urbanization rate over 4% are in the poor South, and they include Haiti, Mali, Cambodia, Yemen, Somalia, etc. These are the states that are also least able to support the mass migration to the urban centers, and also include in these great urban centers Delhi, Kolkata, Mumbai in India, Karachi in Pakistan, Lagos in Nigeria, and Dhaka in Bangladesh. And what will the results of this trend be? Excellent question. The final correlate at the state level of analysis is the proportion of the population that is adolescent, specifically male adolescent, but technically it's hard to tease that out of the equation. A higher proportion of adolescents correlates with a higher probability of terrorism. And what could the reason for this be? Well, what are the defining characteristics of adolescence, specifically male adolescents? Hormones, high unemployment rates, frustrations, unfairness. Throw in there some testosterone and pride, and you really increase the pressure towards male violence. So in summation, the state level has several correlates of terrorism. Each is related to the freedom of the individual, the weakness of the government, or the grievance of the first against the second. Democracies have a much higher level of terrorism than do the other government types, with stronger governments having lower propensities for terrorism. When the government is economically successful, grievances recede. Urban areas contain two needs for terrorists: targets and recruits. Higher terrorism rates are also seen in states with higher adolescent rates, as the grievances felt by adults under adverse circumstances are magnified in hormonal teenagers. Now, ask yourself what we can do to reduce terrorism by fiddling with each of these correlates. Then, ask yourself if it's something that we really should change. For instance, Strong autocracies lack terrorism. That can be easily changed. Let us become a dictatorship here in the United States. We'd be protected from terrorism by a totalitarian government. Terrorism would end for us. But would it be worth it? At the group level focuses on those aspects of the group, a nation, an ethnicity, the elks, if you wish, etc., that correlate with terrorism. There are four main variables of varying levels of quality: group concentration, economic differentials, ethnic differentials, and the previous use of terrorism by the group. Groups with a higher level of concentration also have a higher probability of using terrorism against a containing state. The reasons for this include the increased ability of the terrorism-minded individuals to find each other, and that neighborhoods tend to be wealthy or poor as a group. Thus, issues of geography get translated into issues of ethnicity, a grievance. In the Troubles of Northern Ireland, the two sides lived in different neighborhoods. The Catholics lived in the ghettos of Derry and Belfast. The home of Abu Sayyaf is on the island of Mindanao, a majority Muslim state in the Philippines. The followers of the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh lived in a large ranch in Central Oregon. Groups were concentrated. Economic differentials. As mentioned before, when one group is economically disadvantaged as compared to the rest of the population, grievances form. These grievances give rise to greater pressure to commit terrorism, to punish, and to change the system. These differentials can arise from actual discrimination, from an ethnicity following traditional ways, or from an ethnicity populating a single economic sector or limited geographical region. In the latter two cases, the grievance is unfounded, but still existing. In the first case, the grievance is legitimate, and arguably in the second case, the legitimacy is questionable. An interesting consequence of this factor is that the ethnic group does not actually have to be economically disadvantaged as compared to the rest of the state. They can be economically advantaged, but seeing the rest of the state holding them back. The ETA, for instance, the Scottish National Party, also in the 80s. Other examples include the differentials between the group and the general population include the Weather Underground, here in the United States, the Tuareg, throughout much of the Sahara, and the Roma, throughout much of Europe. Ethnic differentials. When it is easier to identify the outgroup by sight, it becomes much easier to treat them differently. This, as you may expect, gives rise to grievances. This applies to different ethnicities as well as different religions when one religion wears identifiable clothing. The Bat Ayin Underground, an Orthodox Jewish terrorist group, focused their attacks on Palestinian girls. The Kurdistan Workers' Party focuses its attacks on Turks. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam on the Sinhalese. In each case, either the terrorist group or the target group looks different from the rest of the population, so they turn their terrorism on that group. Now, without question, the best predictor of future use of terrorism by a group is past use of terrorism by that group. The reasons are many. The group has already crossed the threshold, so another terrorist attack will not be shocking. The infrastructure already exists, so the next terrorist attack will be logistically easier to commit. Others in the group have already placed their life on the line to commit the act, so if you are a true member of the group, you will emulate them. It took many years before the violence by the Ulster Defense Association crossed the line into terrorism. Once it did, UDA's use of terrorism increased dramatically. Much of the internal propaganda by the Provisional Irish Republican Army was used to convince its members that they need to emulate the martyrs of the past. And once the LTTE laid the groundwork for suicide terrorism, it became much more easy to use it against the Sinhalese. The top three correlates of terrorism in terms of ability to predict terrorism are 1. Former use of terrorism, 2. Government type, and 3. Economic strength. If a specified group used terrorism in the previous year, there is an extremely high chance that that group will use it again this year. This alone makes it important to reduce the reasons groups begin using terrorism. The second best predictor is the type of government. Democracies suffer from terrorism at a much higher rate than strong autocracies. However, autocracies which democratize suffer at an even greater rate. These make it difficult to make the argument in favor of democracies, especially with respect to terrorism. Finally, economies that do not grow at the expected rate have a greater probability of suffering from terrorism. This failure of the government belies its illegitimacy. And so, here are 4 questions I want you to ponder. 1. How easily can states change each of the correlates? 2. Which correlates should states change, given that they can? 3. Why did I not give you a slide on the correlates at the individual level? And 4. Which of the correlates are most powerful in predicting increased terrorist action? And what can we do to stop that? And here we are at the end. The purpose of this module was to increase our understanding of those factors, those variables, that influence the decision of a group to use terrorism or to continue using terrorism. Unfortunately, we discovered that there are several factors that we view as absolute goods. There were also factors tied directly to current trends in humanity, as well as factors that may violate our belief in the separation of economy and state. So what are we to do?